All right, 3:50. I'm gonna start. How's everyone doing? I hope good. Long day. Are anyone fans of The Office? Like really big fans of The Office? Okay, not too many. I won't make my joke. Otherwise, it's gonna be too awkward. So forget it. All right. No, no. My joke was around a specific episode, so it's okay. Um, Only because Office is leaving Netflix, so I started watching it a lot. So that's why, like, I come home from work and I put on Office for at least an hour. I watch 2 episodes, so I'm like, it's like very fresh on my mind right now. Welcome to Flutter Everywhere from mobile to web. I'm going to be talking about Flutter, what it is, and mobile side of it, and then the web side of it. So we'll explore all that craziness. And cross-platform is Flutter. Right now, mostly everyone here should be an Android developer or wanting to be an Android developer. And so you always hear this native and how cool native is and how performant native is. And we've all heard this before. If you're old in the industry, old as in like 5 years plus, you've all heard about this promise of cross-platform that's going to change the world, and we've all been burned by it. Guarantee everyone here has been burned by it. How many people use Cordova here? Back in the day. Yeah, it got burned, and then you used PhoneGap and all that crap. And every time you did something, you started doing like, I remember doing PhoneGap with Angular 1.5, and it was like, my scroll isn't working slowly. It's working. It's not working fast enough. So I go to Stack Overflow and I try to figure out what's wrong. And the solution to make scrolling faster during PhoneGap is remove the multiple layers of DOM that I have. Right? That's ridiculous. And so I had to constantly figure out hacks. And then I went right back to Android. I started my career as Android developer, been doing Android, went into the dark side for iOS for a while, but then went right back to Android. Then did cross-platform because I wanted to build apps that had a greater impact. And so I built this app once, which was ridiculously time-consuming. And all I did, I think 80% of my time on that app was spent hacking cross-platform to make it work, right? Crazy little hacks just to make something work smoothly and stuff. So I gave up cross-platform altogether. I said, screw this. I'm not going to do any of this crap. And I just started doing more Android. Then I moved into machine learning, whatever, but I still do Android apps. But on the back end, I was using a technology called Dart. And this is 2014, I think, or 2013. And I was doing Dart, and mainly because I did Node.js for a while, and JavaScript drove me crazy too for a while. And so I said, let's do something on the back end that's similar to Java, so I can just take my Java skills to the back end. But I don't want to use Spring Boot or any of that. That is way too heavy for just a samples fun app that I'm trying to build. And so I found Dart. I started using it. I enjoyed it a lot, and that's it. And then I was doing Dart, and on the front end I was doing Android, sometimes iOS. And so what happened in Flutter was I got involved in Dart, and typically the way I learn is I'll learn a technology, and I'll learn it enough for like a year, and then I'll want to share how I came across the technology and how I learned it. So I started talking about the technology, outside of this Google developer expert thing that I am part of. And then I started talking about Dart at OSCON, at a couple places. And so Google said, hey, do you want to come speak at DartConf? And it was the first Dart conference ever. And it was basically like half the size of this room. And 80% were Google engineers. So it was basically like me speaking to people who built the product, and it was just being taped for YouTube. And it was a fun time. I talked about moving from Node.js to Dart. And it was a really fun talk. And over here, I started hearing about something that Dart is exploring the mobile space. And I was curious, but in my past, I've been burned by cross-platform. So I was like, oh no, this is going to be like one of those like stupid Cordova things where you're going to write some Dart, transpile it to JavaScript, and it's going to run on your phone, and it's going to be slow. And so I did DartConf, and then the next year, we were in Munich, and I was in the front row, like a nerd, and looking at people talking about Dart. And the last talk was this thing called Sky. And so I started getting excited about Sky. And back then, I was very naive to think that Sky was actually Dart for Android, right? And Kotlin wasn't in the picture back then, and all these, the small group of Dart developers that we were all thinking that Google's going to replace Java with Dart. There were rumors. There's always a rumor, right? Some Android engineer read something somewhere. So anyways, Eric Seidel, who is the product manager of Chrome, gets on stage and starts talking about Sky. And he talks about how they have this problem at Google. And usually the way Google solves problems is they have a problem internally and they're like, let's solve it, right? Hopefully other people have this problem. And if they don't, they kill their products, like 80% of them. So they start talking about Sky and they're like, cool, what is a problem we have? And the problem is they have a lot of Android apps and iOS apps, and their teams are constantly building cross-platform apps, right? They're building the same feature for Android and the same feature for iOS, and it's time-consuming. So they wanted to, make a way where they can build high-performance applications at once for two platforms. And so they started shopping around this idea on all the different Google teams. And the way Google does this is they go to different teams and they say, like a startup, they pitch this idea that, hey, we have this cool idea. Is this usable? Would you want to do this? What language would you write this in? And they had a big matrix. I assume it was a Google spreadsheet. And they started scoring which languages people internally are using at Google. The language that kept coming up for high-value projects on the web was Dart. And one team that was using Dart at Google was this tiny, irrelevant team at Google called AdSense, right? And AdWords. Makes a little tiny bit of money for Google. And so they were using Dart, and the project manager started asking, well, why are you using Dart? And they said, well, previously we were using GWT, that craziness, and their efficiency was slow, right? The build times took a long time, and they were making bugs, whatever. But ever since they started using Dart, internally they did some stat, I don't know, like they're 40% faster, assume, right? And they found themselves to be much faster now using Dart. And so they explained all the language, how the language is flexible and usable and what they like about it, what they don't. And so Google said, cool, we're gonna make Dart the language to write cross-platform apps with. So that problem, they solved it just by internal user feedback, research. It went on for months, I assume. Problem number two was, how do we actually execute this vision? Right? How do we get actual Dart running on mobile? And so they thought about it and they said, well, we have a very fast rendering engine that pretty much the entire world uses, unless you use Firefox, which is WebKit, right? And they had WebKit, which is now called Blink, and that is optimized to run on absolutely everywhere, even like a Raspberry Pi. And that rendering engine is very powerful. If you get rid of JavaScript, the DOM, all the craziness, you have something that draws video really well, HD video, games, everything really, really well. So why don't we take that and get a language to draw something on top of that rendering engine? And so that became Sky, which then became Flutter. So they had this idea that they're gonna follow three principles, right? They wanted to make this fast, beautiful, and natural, right? And by fast, I mean they wanted to make this 60 frames per second running on native Android and iOS. So last year or the year before, I went down to Flutter's offices at Google, some area at Google that they have, and they have these big, big screens. And these screens are very interesting. Whenever you make a code push, usually at our companies or projects, we have unit tests, right? We hope we do. But we have unit tests, and there's a code runner, CI, CD, that runs and says, cool, your test passed. Google has unit tests too, obviously, but they also have a very specific kind of unit test for Flutter, which is when you actually make a commit, it runs these unit tests to make sure that these components are still rendering at 60 frames per second. And if there's any deviation in this, it flags, I don't know, I'm assuming like Larry or Sergey come down and slap the developer that, kill the frame rate. But, everything stops and they got to fix this. And so that was very interesting to see, and that's how focused they are to make sure that it's fast. Because they know this is not a new idea, but a very controversial idea. And any slowness, a user will say, well, this app is running slow. It doesn't really look like an Android app or iOS app. I don't care about it. And then the whole mirage is gone. So secondly, it's not a web view. So just because it's using WebKit, it doesn't mean it's a web view, right? It's just a rendering engine. So it's the Skia rendering engine, whatever it is. So nothing related to the web. And so they wanted to make this beautiful. And subjective, but Google had this thing called material design, and they said, cool, why don't we just take material design and implement it in Flutter one-to-one. So if the Flutter team sits here in the early days, the material design team sat there. And they worked together and they made sure that all these components were one-to-one identical to the material design spec. That means that when you're building a Flutter app, it's going to look pretty and it's going to look consistent on all devices because of the rendering engine. Lastly, they wanted to make it look natural. What they mean by natural is when you write an app, they want to make sure that it behaves the same way as a native app on that platform, right? So if you have an Android app and you use a list view and you fling it, it's going to give that weird blue glow at the bottom, right? They want to make sure that when you build, and if you have a Cordova app or PhoneGap app, it's going to be complicated to get that flow. Sometimes you have to do all these CSS tweaks, et cetera, whatever. But on iOS, that blue glow doesn't exist. On iOS, when you fling a list view, it bounces. And you don't want to implement those bounce physics. And you don't want your users to feel that, hey, this doesn't seem like an iOS app. And so out of the box, Flutter made sure that it behaves, your application automatically behaves like the platform that it's running on, right? And so those are the three principles that they adopted: fast, beautiful, natural. And I'll give you a quick Hello World demo of how it works. So here, you develop a Flutter app in IntelliJ. I'm just going to blast my font size. And so I'm just going to run the emulator here. And I'm just going to use the iOS emulator because the Android emulator will take ages. No offense to the Gradle crowd. Cool. All right. So I'm going to run my app. And what it's doing right now, whether if it was Android or iOS, it would actually run Gradle build or Xcode build. So again, it's not doing anything magical. It's following the same pipeline as any normal app, right? All it's doing is just taking the code, compiling it, making sure that it runs under a rendering engine, and packaging all that up into a APK or AAB, or iOS is like an IPA or whatever. And it's going to deploy it. Oh, is it? Oh, no, it's deploying on my Pixel. Okay. Right on iPhone. So here, I accidentally made it run on my Pixel that's connected, so it's actually initializing Gradle, which will take ages. I don't know why. So we'll just get it deploying on simulator here. So in the meantime, so as this is happening, one of the natural questions that come up is, cool, well, how do we get this working on web? And so I started talking to Google about this 2 years ago, as well as many other developers. And they said, how do we get our Flutter apps on web? And there were a lot of weird hacks going on. And the big thing that was stopping them 2 years ago and a year ago was the resources to actually invest in web. You have a cool product, but you just don't want to build everything. And then Flutter was built for mobile, right? The components are built for mobile. One of the big things on web is accessibility, just the way the web feels. You don't want to, when you're dealing with like a simulator, you know that you're dealing with a simulator, and so the interactions are off. It's not like a web app where you can right-click and copy and paste and all that stuff. And so we'll get to that now that my demo is loaded, but we'll understand how Google got over those limitations here. So here is my simple Flutter app. I'm going to hit this button, and it's going to say, you push this button this many times, right? That's cool, and this is a very, very simple app. But what I can do with this app is Flutter has a feature called Hot Reload. And I'm sure if you've read the marketing or if you've tried Flutter, you've heard about Hot Reload. And what Hot Reload is basically a way to instantly have code changes. So like web development, where you make a change in your CSS, it automatically reloads. That's what you can do with Flutter's Hot Reload. So I'm going to change colors to red. I'm going to hit save, and it changed it right away. And if I was deploying this on my phone, I could do the same thing. So it's not limited to the emulator. What I can also do is I can add components. So I'm going to add another component here. I'm going to say text hello Android Summit. Spelled hello wrong. Cool. And you can see that I've added hello Android Summit here. And that's all cool. Awesome. Now, what if I want to change the implementation? If you see here, when I press plus, the number counter is going up. So two things have happened. As I'm making changes, the state of my application hasn't changed. So it still says 26, which is very interesting. And this type of stuff, is very powerful because if you're building a very complicated app and you're 3 levels deep and you're holding on to an OAuth token or something, you don't want your whole app restarting and then having to debug the whole thing again. So as I'm pressing this button, counter goes up by 1. What if I want the implementation of my counter to change? So I'm going to go into the function here that says increment counter, and it says counter plus plus. I'm going to say, cool, counter is equal to counter plus 5. Now I'm going to hit plus again, and it goes up, right? Keeps going up. So in real time, I've changed the actual implementation of my method, and I'm able to debug and build it. Now, there's this cool trick that I do with hot reload. Let's hope it works. This is purely unscripted. I mean, I've done it before, but it can always fail at any time. So the story is, I got my friend who works at, I don't even know where he works, Twitter, Facebook, some of those guys. But in his spare time, he's building a music app. And it's called Ty's Music. It's an interesting app, but it's on iOS and Android, I think. And no, it's only on iOS, and he wants to build an Android app. So I convinced him, hey, you should build this in Flutter. And so he was an Android developer originally, so he made a Google search about how do I do a relative layout in Flutter. So how do I do a relative layout in Flutter? Cool. Equivalent of a relative layout. And he asked this question to the Flutter community on Stack Overflow. This is my UI, and this is what I want to build. How do I do this in Flutter? So one interesting thing about the Flutter team is, even as you start developing, whether it's for Flutter mobile or web, they're very, very helpful. They will go out of their way and they will answer a question. So this person starts answering this question and says, Flutter layouts are usually blah, 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 blah. And then he says, you know what? Here's a screenshot. I just did the whole thing for you, which is great. Okay? So he did this whole thing for Tofik, and we're going to copy it. And this is, the reason behind this demo is the power of hot reload. So I'm going to go into my app. Okay, this is my app still. I'm going to Command V and paste the code that I just got. All right? I'm going to hit save, and the entire app will change from your eyes if my magic trick works. So I'm going to hit Command save, and there we go. Right? The whole thing has changed. Cool. So now, not only has it changed, it's not an image, it's actually interactive. So there's a reason why I do this trick, because as you're developing in Flutter, you can go and you can find code snippets, right? And you can actually iteratively build your app very quickly. You can paste your code snippet into your function. Like say you want to build a closest nearest algorithm for something, right? You copy and paste that code into your implementation, you hit save, and you can just test it out right there. This is an extreme example. You're never going to do this, but this is how far you can push hot reload. Now something I do is I press Command Z and see if it reverts back. That's crazy because I don't think it'll work, but let's see. I'm going to hit Command Z and hit it back. Yeah, so the app has changed so much that it's not going to go back. There's too many widgets now and there's too much state. But regardless, oh, actually, wait. Oh, no, hold on. Oh, yeah, okay. There we go. It worked. But it got rid of the state because that variable was completely removed, etc. But I can iteratively switch back and forth. You're never going to do this, but you can see the power of hot reload. So let's keep moving. So at a high level, how does Flutter look like? This is an important thing because we're going to do a compare and contrast. There's a framework which is all written in Dart. You got your material design and you have your Cupertino, which is the iOS version. Then you got your widgets underlay. So if you don't care about material design, right? If you have your own custom brand, and I will show an app that did it at the end, and you don't care about material design, you can actually just extend the widgets and implement your own design on top of it, right? You're by no means bound to material design. It will save you a lot of time, and there's a lot of user research behind material design, but honestly, you don't have to stick to it. Then you have your rendering, animation, painting, so you get everything. Then you have a layer called services. So if Samsung tomorrow comes out with Samsung Note 11 or 12, whatever number they're at right now, and it has a nose sensor, right? You unlock your phone using your nose. Flutter's not going to go ahead and implement the nose sensor. It's not Flutter's job to implement the nose sensor. However, you can either find a package or you can write your own nose sensor plugin that runs on Java or Kotlin, and your services from your Dart app or your Flutter app can interact with that service and say, yes, nose verified. So you can always extend your Flutter app however you want. Lastly, you got the shell that no one really cares about, whoever does C++ anymore, but you have your Skia rendering engine, you have your Dart VM, Mojo, which is like, if you really want to learn about that, go to flutter.dev, and they have this, deep down, they have this demoed tutorial, 45 minutes long, that really talks about the internals of Flutter. It's a year and a half old and maybe outdated, but it's also always good to learn. So to recap why Flutter for mobile, it's a tight integrated development environment. You can do hot reload and all sorts of crazy stuff. One code base targeting both platforms. One thing I don't add here, Dart is a boring language. Like everyone automatically here knows Dart. If you've done Java, Kotlin, or whatever, there's nothing really to learn. Maybe one or two things that you're like, oh, okay, this is how Dart does it. But you can pick up Dart within like 30 minutes, right? It's a very boring language. Faster platform iteration. So if you have a bug on Android, most probably you have a bug on iOS too here, and you can fix it both at once. If you want to add a feature, you can get those features out at once. And then easy talk to native platforms. Like I said, you have a services layer, so you're not really limited by what Flutter offers. You can always extend it. Cool, so we'll forget that. All right. However, now, what about if you took that rendering engine at the bottom that was all in C++ and stuff, and you replaced it, because everything's in Dart. And what Dart did was, because Dart originally started off as a web language, you were writing backends in Dart, but you were also writing frontends in Dart. They already had a great compiler that they called the Dart Developer Compiler, DDC. And what it does is it takes your Dart code and transpiles it into very modern ES 2019, whatever ES is at, language, right? Code that really runs really, really well. So you can theoretically, they postulated that they said, cool, we can take the Dart code that we're generating, because Flutter is just Dart code, and render it onto the canvas. And they did that. What they did was they understood that there's some components right now. Right now, the big asterisk here is Flutter Web is not ready for production. Probably in like 6 months or 7 months. Right now, it's ready for prototypes, it's ready for beta if you want to get your app out, but there is still some work. And that work is really around the accessibility of things, of how some things are interactive and some things aren't, where, for example, a button looks like a mobile button floating on the page, right? It doesn't look like a CSS button or a web button. So there's some caveats there, but theoretically you can pull it off, and that's what they did. And I'll show you a demo of it. So the way you, this app is called Filipino Cuisine. It's a great sample app to use. So once you have Flutter running and stuff, you need to install this thing called WebDev. And so let me show you where is it? Flutter packages. Okay, you need to install this thing called WebDev. And what WebDev is if you were a Dart developer doing web development, it's just like NodeMon, or not NodeMon, like a web server that takes your Dart code, compiles it, and runs it as on port 8080 or something. So you need to actually activate it. And once you do, you can actually go in any of your packages. There's some Dart code here, Flutter code here, You can go webdev serve. And so what happens right now is it's actually going through all the Flutter code, and it's saying, all right, I'm going to compile this to JavaScript. So just like the same build process happened previously on mobile, Xcode and Gradle, it's doing the same build process, right? Whatever is needed for web. And it says, great, it's all running. I'm going to deploy this on port 8080. So I'm going to go to port 8080. And here we go, right? This does not look like a typical web app, right? This is a sample web app. What they did was they took the exact same Flutter mobile code. So if I were to resize this, there we go, it looks like a mobile app, right? And so what they did was they took a mobile app that was already running, and with a few lines of code changes, and we could talk about that, they just ported it to web. And so right now, if you have a Flutter app, or if you're thinking about building an app, you are going to have to think about responsiveness, right? You just kind of assume you're going to take your mobile app that looks like this and deploy it to web, and it's going to look ugly like this, because that's an ugly looking app. However, it's working, and so you will have to design it in such a way that you can have responsiveness and stuff. So there is some architecture Technically, it's one-to-one, but in terms of UX, you are going to have to think about it. But with that said, this is fully interactive. So, I can swipe here, and as I swipe, the recipes change, and I can click on this button here, and the screen opens. So you can see there was a bit of lag there. These are things that they're working on, animations, and some fonts are missing here. Right now, I don't even think it supports proper fonts, unless without a lot of work. The boxes, I can check box. So functionally, it's working. In terms of it's ready for your customers, probably like 60% there, 70% there. But it's getting there. So if you look at the code here, and I'm going to open up this, it looks identical to Flutter code. Development workspace. Great. All right, well, it does not want to open. So I'm just going to open up in terminal here. Lib main.dart. Something happened with my Sublime where it refuses to open anything, any projects. So my IntelliJ. So I'm just going to open it up with Sublime. Cool. So this is just like any other Dart app, right? Flutter app. The only difference is you have to change Flutter/material to Flutter Web/material, right? So when you're building your app, you're gonna have to do like a conditional import where you say if this is running on desktop or mobile, then do Flutter. If it's running on web, do Flutter Web. Aside from that, most of your code stays the same. The parts of your code that will not compile or run is if you're using frameworks like Firebase, GPS stuff, anything that plugs into the database, anything that uses data store and all that stuff, there's currently no solution for it. You're gonna have to kind of hack it yourself. And so it's really intended for very, very simple apps right now. And very intended like this, like the conference app for Android Summit probably would work with Flutter Web, right? Because it's not doing anything complicated. There's not a lot of stuff happening. But if you have a mobile app that's doing anything remotely connected to GPS and stuff, it's mostly not going to work. There's a good case study called Reflectly, and Reflectly made it work really well. And I'll show you the demo of Reflectly. And the reason why is the entire app is built with this idea of it's a journaling app. And so there's not a lot of interaction with any other services on the phone. So they were able to, within a day or two, just bypass some of the services that they were interacting with and get the app running. Cool, so sure. We talked about this, I won't get into that, but I'll just show you a sample code. I know someone earlier was asking me, well, how do I talk to my native application? This is how you do it. You call platform.invoke method, and it calls get battery level. Something like this, though, won't work on web because there is no native component right now. However, they're working on Flutter Web, but they're also working on Flutter Desktop. And if you look at a presentation on Flutter Live, which is a conference that happened in January, they had a nice demo of a game that New York Times built that was the same code base running on mobile, on web, and desktop. And so eventually we'll get there. Probably I'll do a talk like this again next year. And by then, what we will have is something where we can actually build a Flutter app and easily compile it to web and desktop with the same code base with very minimal changes. So don't go all happy and tell your employer we're going to fire the web dev team. We're not there yet. Next year, we'll fire them. Cool. So because everyone here is an Android developer, I wrote this doc for Flutter about, I don't know, a year ago or something, called Flutter for Android Developers. And so, yes, take a screenshot, and then I'll go to the, okay, Flutter for Android Developers. All right, so you will find this on the website. And what this documentation is, it's basically one-to-one mapping. I said, all right, in the past, when I was learning, I had no idea what the equivalent of a view is in Flutter. I want to know. And so I did my research, I understood it, and so I just passed that knowledge along. So what's an equivalent to a view? It's a widget, and I talk about it. How do I update widgets? This is where most Android developers get stuck. If you're not used to reactive programming, you're gonna go button.title equals Faisal and say, why is nothing updating, right? So we talk about how reactive programming works and stateless and stateful widgets. And then we even go into detail like where is it? HTTP. Talk about how to make HTTP calls. What's the equivalent of a run-on UI thread in Flutter? Cool. And so we get into all this detail. So this is a very, very good documentation if you're trying to learn Flutter. And you can easily extend all this to Flutter for Web when it's there, because all this is just idiomatic Flutter. We're not using any third-party libraries or any other extra components. And the same thing is for any iOS developers out there, Flutter for iOS developers, and for web developers. There's actually Flutter for web devs, and even Flutter for React developers, right? So anyone who's doing anything here can easily get started with Flutter. The language is boring. You already know it. The framework is very exciting because there's a lot of interesting things to learn. I guarantee most people will get stuck for the first hour or so, just trying to understand and wrap your head around how does this work. Coming from Android, I didn't even know how to switch a screen because I'm like, well, there's no activity. What am I calling? What am I doing? And so in that documentation or any other one of these documentations, you'll understand how to do all that. So I'm going to show this demo of Reflectly before time runs out, and then you guys can ask me questions. So Reflectly here, view. It's a very interesting app, and this goes back to what I was saying before is, if you don't care about material design, you don't have to follow material design. If your designers have a very specific UI in mind, you can just follow that. So here, hi there, I'm Reflectly, your new journaling companion. You can download this app on Android and iOS. I haven't built this app. I wish I did because you guys are making a shit ton of money. But come on here and you can say, cool, hi Reflectly. And there's a nice smooth animation. Visor is not great with animation, but if you use it on your phone, you'll see it. And I can say, cool, my nickname is Faisal. And so right off the bat, none of this is a normal looking app. It's very custom, but it's using Flutter. It's all Flutter widgets, just nicely themed and nicely styled. So I can change this, and you can see this nice animation happen. And all this is possible with Flutter, right? There's also another app here called The History of Everything. And this app was shown at Flutter Live. And again, this app is available on Play Store, I think iOS also. But this, when you look at the animation and fluid stuff going on here, the fluid nature of the app, all this is written in Flutter. And it's, all the animations are done in a framework called Flare. There was a talk about it or a workshop about it earlier. So see all this happening, and I can zoom in and zoom out and stuff. All this would take a lot of time to do on native Android or even iOS. With Flutter, it's very straightforward because Flutter, has understood all the common design patterns and language patterns and what mobile devs want to be and what mobile apps should be. And so Flutter's incorporated all that. So it's very easy to build, very complex applications like this where nice animations and stuff going on. So with that said, does anyone have any questions or comments and discussion items? Yes?
Yes, my name is Joe White. One of the questions that one always has is the amount of time it took on Android and iOS to get the graphical storyboard generated down sort of layout. Certainly Flutter started with code. Imagine what this looks like in your head.
Yes.
See whether it works right.
Yep.
We're still there, right?
Yes, we are still there. With that said, I did get a top secret email saying that there is something coming out sometime soon that they're investigating. It's nothing production quality, but they are talking about, in this top secret email, that they're looking into a storyboard builder, right? I don't know how it looks because I still haven't done it. I actually probably have that call tomorrow to look at it for the first time, but they're thinking about this.
Have you run into anyone who's taking an existing app and just basically looking at the translation of the XML and generating some stuff that way?
Not really. It would be interesting. but no one's really done that. There are some editors out there that you can drag and drop and stuff. None of them are production level quality, and they're not built for like designers and stuff in mind. So I know for sure Google's looking at it. Will it ever get released? I don't know. It really comes down to the user feedback and how that tool is. But I know that is a common pain point in a lot of ways that a lot of people run into. However, once you start developing a Flutter app, you realize that it's not that big of a pain point. You can quickly iterate quick enough. But yes, it is a pain point for enough people that they're looking into it.
It's still where it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Probably the only web developer in here.
Cool.
But when you build the web application from like your Flutter source code, in order to make it look more fluid, I guess, for web, do you just make changes to like the compile code that it spits out?
No, you make changes to the actual source code. So the compile code that it spits out is like obfuscated, mangled JavaScript, right? So you're making changes to actually the Flutter code, and you're, right now you have like if statements where you're saying if platform dot is web, then make the padding smaller. If platform is mobile, make it bigger, etc. Yes.
Currently, I read that Flutter is only available on Google Chrome. Do you think that they're going to open it up for Firefox, or
No, I'm sure they will, because there's nothing inherently specific going on. There's a lot of HTML and CSS rendering happening. So just in terms of development vector surface area, they just want to focus on Chrome right now. But I am sure they'll open it up too, because that would, if they don't, then it would be pretty stupid, right? Because there's still enough market share on Firefox, Safari, and all these guys using it. So I'm sure they'll get there. I don't think Google wants Flutter to be Flash. Yes.
Any comments on integrating some of the functionality with things like Firebase or some of the other things that may be delivered, not via Dart, but
Right.
Java or other elements of that?
So Flutter has a very rich ecosystem of packages right now, and those can be found at pub.dev. And pub.dev, if anyone's done web development, is the NPM of the world or the Maven of the world, of the Dart world. So here you can search Firebase, and there's a Firebase plugin there, right? And you can just integrate it very easily. And it's supported by Google. A lot of these plugins are supported by Google because they've built it. And there's a lot of them that aren't, but the developers are very responsive, and they're making, they accept pull requests and all that stuff.
That's a good addition from some of the times when we got started.
Yes, exactly. It's become very rich. Yes.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One's about this, having a package
Cool.
on Pub, and then next question is about it looks very React-like. Is there a pattern that imagine state? If so, like how would you do that? Also, how would you do like Instagrams?
Right. So 3 questions. Number 1 is how do you publish? I think you just go publish on pub Flutter, and they have documentation about this. Yeah, publishing a package, right? They talk about how to do it. You have to go pub.create, create it, and push it up, right? Second question was reactive frameworks. Dart does support, or Flutter does support, there's patterns for Flux, or yeah, there's a lot of patterns out there. So whatever you can find on React, that pattern does exist. But the most common one that I'm seeing is this pattern called the block pattern. And there's a good video on it. There's a show called The Boring Flutter Show, where the Flutter developers sit there and it's like unedited for like 2 hours long, and they're just sitting there building an app. And what's great about it is you can actually see them screw up and run into roadblocks and work backwards and fix it, and which is great because a lot of times you just see it working perfectly and you're like, well, I don't know how they got to that conclusion. And so as you watch this video, you'll see them try different design patterns and see which one they land on and why they land on it. So I recommend everyone check out the Boring Flutter Show. Lastly, Flutter supports async await. So if you've used async await in a language like JavaScript and the TypeScript or whatever, same type of asynchronous programming.
Is there something like equivalent to generated functions?
Yes, there is. There's futures, there's generators, you'll find all that. A great thing to do is Dart by example. There's a website called Dart by Example, and here you can quickly learn about Dart. So like when I said Dart's a very boring language, everyone understands it. Almost everyone can read this code and know exactly what it's doing, right? So this is very inspirational to everyone because everyone just learned Dart. So in terms of, how do you do an if statement? Right, well, where is it? Okay, it's missing there. My internet's not working. All right, here, everyone can know exactly what this is doing, right? It's creating a constant name, whatever. So in this file, there is the generators. Where do I see it? Generators. And you can do generator code, and you can see how it works and stuff. So Dart by example is your best thing to learn Dart very quickly. Yes, one more? Yeah, yes, go on.
What sort of unit continuous testing framework do you use with Flutter?
Flutter has a built-in one called Test. I think it's called Flutter Test, I think. But that's the one that I've used, and there's a good documentation on it about unit tests. There's widget tests and even integration tests when you're trying to build a very complicated thing. So, they've worked hard on this to make sure that testing and stuff is great. So you can go on Flutter doc/testing and read all about it. Any other questions, or are we good? Cool. So if you guys have other questions, if you guys want to tweet at me and stuff, you can always email me or even tweet at me, faisalabid@gmail.com or @faisalabid. Thank you.